I'll bet most of you in this room have too many crashes amongst your fleet. What fleet doesn't? I was down in Midland, Texas about 3 years ago. We had a fleet based out of Midland that has about 6,000 to 7,000 vehicles. We have been monitoring the location and operating status of those vehicles for a couple of years. The chief safety officer came up to me and said, you know, out of our fleet of 6,000 or 7,000 vehicles, we have a crash a day. And he said, I don't know if that's good or bad, but it's too many. Is there anything that you can do to help us figure out which of our drivers is most likely to get in a crash before they get in a crash? I thought, wow, sounds like a crystal ball. Sounds like a really good thing if we could pull that off. And I kind of threw up my arms and said, I really don't think I know how to do that. Modifying human behavior is tough, really tough. Monitoring it might be easier than modifying it. So I started looking into this whole issue of accidents. They're not. They're crashes. And we started paying a lot of attention to what kind of things could help us predict which drivers were most likely to get into a crash. A couple weeks after this interesting conversation down in Midland, Texas, I was having dinner one night with our new governor, who's been a friend for a while. And we were talking about this conversation. And he said to me, you know, we've got about 2,200 vehicles in the city and county fleet. And he said, I'll bet you if we could get people to drive a little bit more conservatively, we'd end up saving a lot of fuel. And I said, well, you're right. You could. You could probably save as much as 22% reduction in fuel consumption between people who drive conservatively and people who drive aggressively. That's a lot of fuel. So he said, well, we just won the Democratic National Convention here in Denver. This was early 2008. He said, I'll give you access to the 2,200 vehicles if you'll want to run a little science experiment. Let's see if we can identify drivers that are at risk and give them feedback that would help them become safer and better drivers. And if we do, I'll bet we save a bunch of fuel, and I'll bet we can brag about how green we are as a city. So Encana, big natural gas company that not enough of us think about when we turn on our stoves and our furnaces, Encana stepped up and provided a large funding for that science project. And we ran that program for a year, and it was fascinating. Totally a science project. 3 big black boxes, 2 antennas. I'll tell you some of the things we put on these cars. When we ran the science experiment, we had no idea, one, whether we would be able to identify which drivers were most likely to get into a preventable crash, and ultimately whether we could influence them to change their behavior and influence crash rates. So our theory was this, that there are warning signs out there and that we just weren't watching for them. I can give you a great example of this. One of the most catastrophic crashes that a large truck is likely to be in is a rollover crash, right? Pretty bad when we have a rollover crash. I'll bet you that for every rollover crash, there's been 500 leading indicators. That leading indicator might be a driver who's just gotten a little sloppy. They're going around a turn just a little bit too fast. Doesn't catch up with them the first time. Doesn't catch up with them the 100th time. But relative to all the other drivers, that guy who's going around that turn just a little bit too fast, sooner or later, it'll catch up to him. And if we could give that driver a little bit of feedback before that crash occurs, it says, hey, relative to your peers, you're doing some stuff that puts you at risk. Well, we can do a lot to help that guy come home to his family every night safely. So right now, for most of us, we're sending our fleet out relatively blind, and we're hoping for the best. And I don't think it's good enough anymore. So I constantly think about these notion of leading indicators. Things like motor vehicle incidents, MVIs, they're after the effect. They're after the fact. I look at technologies like DriveCam, for example. I think, fantastic. If I've had an incident, I can see what was going on in that car. I'm more interested in keeping people out of incidents. I want to keep people as safe as they can possibly be. And oftentimes that means if we've had an actual incident or a crash, that we missed some of the leading indicators. So our question, our challenge was, could we pick up on leading indicators earlier? This would be nirvana from my perspective. Wouldn't it be awesome if we knew which of our drivers were most likely to get in a crash? And if we did, what would we do about it? Imagine if we could change our remedial driver training programs to be laser-like focused on those drivers that are at greatest risk. That would be a pretty incredible thing. So here's the deal. In the last 5 years, the technology has changed dramatically. We now have tools which do enable us to monitor subtle aspects of human behavior that we ourselves may not be conscious of. And I'll give you a very personal story. When I first put the technology that we helped develop with the City and County of Denver into my own vehicle, I noticed that every morning on my morning commute that I was racking up a whole bunch of little, tiny, hard braking events. Now, these are not the kind of things that, cause smoke to come from the tires. These are little, tiny, subtle events that I wasn't even conscious of. And I looked at my behavior and I thought, you know what? What is going on in my morning commute that I'm generating all these little, tiny, hard braking events? Well, it turned out that, like most of us, I was on my cell phone. As I'm on my cell phone in the morning, I'm not running into the guy ahead of me, but I'm catching myself constantly. I'm distracted. And these leading indicators were showing up in these lots of little, tiny, hard braking events. And so as a result, I have changed that behavior, and now the number of tiny, hard braking events that I generate have almost dropped to zero. And it is it's really fascinating to see when we put technologies like this out into a commercial fleet, the healthy competition that begins to happen between drivers. Imagine if we were to take all of you and put technology onto your vehicles. Some of you would be on the right side of that bell curve. Some of you would be on the left side of that bell curve. And imagine if there were big rewards for being on the right side of that bell curve. You're never going to get rid of the bell curve. But imagine if you could compress it a little bit. Just shift those drivers at risk more to the center. That would have an enormous impact on your operating expenses, your risk profiles, your fleet safety. The technologies that are helping us do this are things like accelerometers. You've seen them in the iPhone. When you turn the iPhone around, those are accelerometers. They measure rate of change of motion. There are technologies like GPS that allow us to know when a vehicle is in motion. And Rick Kaplis before was talking about detecting the use of cell phone while a vehicle's in motion. Wouldn't it be awesome if you knew that driver A was very conscientious about pulling over to use their cell phone, and that they were actually stationary when they placed that call, and that driver B was actually in motion when they were texting? Wouldn't it be phenomenal if you, through the use of GPS technology, could have that kind of insight and you'd pull driver B aside and say, Billy, you keep this up. This is against company policy. We will enforce it. So we have a big, big challenge in our society today. And that challenge is to figure out, what do we do about this behavior relative to cell phones and distracted driving? It has become so ingrained in the way that we think, the way that we conduct our work, the way that we communicate. It is going to be a tough thing to change. It's one thing to put policies in place. The key is putting tools in place that enable us to monitor and enforce this. And technologies like the ones that we're helping to develop are enabling us to go out there and actually correlate the use of in-motion vehicles to cell phone bills and cell phone records. A lot of you have drivers that are driving at night. We all know that even just night driving places them at greater risk. What if we could warn those drivers and say, you know, relative to your peers, you're spending a lot of time night driving. You ought to be aware of the fact that you're at a higher risk profile than everybody else. So, bottom line is, I just wanted to hold this thing up. the drivers that use technologies like this get a scorecard every single week. It's a numeric scorecard. It tells them that out of a possible score of 100, you got a score of 83. Here's the things that you're doing well. Here's the things that you could be doing better. And the impact that this is having to foster positive competitive environment where people are driven to higher and higher levels of safety and conscientious driving is absolutely phenomenal. It is transforming fleet operations now for some of the largest companies here in Colorado and across the nation. The technology is affordable. It pays for itself. It pays for itself purely in the reduction of fuel consumption. And frankly, it's part of a responsible corporate policy to put technologies like this in place. All right, thank you all very, very much for your time today. Thank you for coming.